And we are back with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. Today's guest is Connor Eccles. He's one of the great writers that they have over at Responsible Statecraft. We have, it seems like somebody in from that outlet almost every week on this show. And today I actually wasn't planning to have a guest, but I did want to talk about the subject that I still have for today's show, and that is ICE and the IDF. And this morning, Connor has a fantastic new article out on this, so we'll be talking about that. And if we got time, the military buildup in the Middle East and Trump's threats towards Iran. So, Connor, I just really want to get it right into it. But how you doing today? And happy to have you on the show for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, hey, thanks for having me on, Kyle. I'm excited. It's quite a fun topic to start with. It's a bit of a hot one.
Absolutely. Everybody needs to read this article. It's actually going to be the spotlight tomorrow at antiwar.com. And of course, it's at Responsible Statecraft. The title, Why Israeli Counterterrorism Tactics Are Showing Up in Minnesota. And Connor, I had seen some posts on X over the past few days about people trying to link what's happening in Minneapolis with, the IDF's ties to U.S. law enforcement. And I was interested in this, and I was about to sit down and do some research. And I find this article from you at Responsible Statecraft having already done it. So let's just I'm going to let you go through it. Just how deep are the ties between ICE and the IDF?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I would broaden the way that we look at it to not just being ICE and the IDF, but ICE and Israeli law enforcement, Israeli agencies in general. And the ties are really deep. You know, the story really goes back to the founding of ICE and to the founding of the Department of Homeland Security as a separate department, right? Some people might forget, some of your listeners might be on the younger side and not remember that they restructured the whole government in the early days of the War on Terror. They moved border patrol and things like that under this thing called the Department of Homeland Security, and that has from the start had this sort of counterterrorism focus. So from that very beginning, there's been a relationship where they said, "Hey, the Israelis understand counterterrorism. They have dealt with this for years, so we're going to go and we're going to take lessons from them." And so, you know, from officials, former officials I talked to, from people who saw this. This plays out in a bunch of different ways. So there are formal ways that this happens through the government's government-to-government relations. You've got joint trainings between American ICE officials or CBP officials and Israeli people from the Ministry of National Security over there, which handles things like border patrol, kind of a similar thing to DHS here. So you've got trainings like that. You've got one former senior DHS official told me that, you know, they were even giving throughout, even during the Obama administration and during various administrations, giving grants to Israeli officers to do work on things like countering violent extremism and then to present on those at conferences with Americans. So there's a really deep connection from those trainings. But then there's technology transfer that's been really supported by Congress. There's a few specific programs that have been funded that way, but you also have more casual things where you see Israeli companies like Cellebrite or like Paragon that have gotten relationships, that have gotten contracts with ICE in order to hack phones, for example. That's part of helping these surveillance efforts that they are doing. And then you also have this really interesting thing that comes up a lot in the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is the presence of all these NGOs and these 501c3s like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, or JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, both of which have somewhat different goals, but both of which lead tours of American law enforcement officials to Israel and try to teach them how to deal with counterterrorism, basically, while they're there. And what we're seeing now, and the point of the article is that, we're starting to see the fruits, I guess, rotten fruits of this connection between the two countries. It's not quite a one-way road, right? This is sort of a thing that was developed together. These are in many ways tactics that got tried out and discussed and, you know, had their first attempt in the West Bank in particular, but that are now being brought to American streets. Things like, you know, expanding use of profiling, expanding use of these different surveillance technologies, these aggressive arrests. We're seeing all these tactics, and that's the result of 2 decades of working very closely together.
Yeah. I mean, if we're looking at the West Bank in 2026, it seems that the Israeli soldiers, the occupation forces, have kind of given up on trying to find a pretext to shoot the Palestinians. But in prior years, you would see a lot of scenarios where it seemed the Israeli soldiers were creating the conditions so they have a reason to kill a Palestinian. And that seems to me a lot of what happened with, I guess, the killing of Renee Nicole Brown, who was, the ICE officer stepped in front of her car and then shot her. And then the other one seems to be more just out either a willful execution or, mistaking the scenario that was going on and believing that the man had a gun when he didn't. But, either way, just two really awful shootings. I didn't see this in your article, but I'm just wondering, in any of your research, did you come across anything that suggested some of the ICE officers in Minneapolis or maybe the shooters were actually involved with these IDF joint Israeli trainings?
I was not able to. I mean, we don't even have the names of a lot of the officers that were involved in this, so that makes it quite difficult. And another factor that is not directly related to the sort of relationship between the U.S. and Israel, but that is an interesting parallel, is that basically ICE has very rapidly swelled the number of officers that it is sending out to the streets in the US. There's like 3,000 between ICE and CBP in Minneapolis alone. It used to be that there were only 10,000 total ICE officers and agents. Now there's 22,000, and that happened in the last year. And that's actually very similar to the IDF, because the IDF is a reserve army. They rely on people that might have been trained years ago that are being called up, not always necessarily in shape, not always necessarily up to date on standard operating procedures, on the rules of the road, and who will engage in excessively violent things because there's a simple lack of discipline in the force. But I mean, I want to play off one point that you made there, just pointing out that there's a talk of, okay, is there instigation or whatever, and that's a way that I think is another interesting similarity between what's happened in Minneapolis, the way you've described it, and then also what happens in the West Bank, is that the soldiers in the IDF, or people in Israeli military police or various other things, will always be able to point to, hey, they were throwing stones maybe, or they were doing these things, they were acting as spotters for IDF operations, and so they were involved in combat in some sense. And so we're seeing a similar type of excuse. We're seeing this way of saying that anyone who is engaged in civil disobedience is liable to be considered a terrorist.
Yeah, the rhetoric out of the administration has been extremely concerning. I do have this clip to play. This is a former U.S. Lieutenant General speaking on how he views ICE in the American streets now.
ICE and DHS are neither military nor police. Both the military as a unit and the police of any city have different charters. But ICE's charter is civil immigration enforcement. That's their job: identifying, detaining, and removing individuals who violate immigration law. So that is more administrative and legal, not tactical. Yet these guys are running around. And from the standpoint of a former soldier, I will tell you they are an undisciplined militia, and the leadership is awful. Yet we have recently seen ICE dressed up like soldiers, running through the battlefield, as it were, in civilian vehicles, maneuvering like assault teams and engaging civilians as they are hostile forces. And then their leaders in Washington are saying these hostile forces are terrorists and anarchists. So in my view, they're not doing any of the things well. This is not policing, and it's not military service. It's something dangerously undefined, and I think it's now, as it has been over the last several months, coming back to haunt them.
So as an American, and I am not someone who has been spending the past decade saying that Trump is a Nazi, Trump is a dictator, Trump's never going to allow new elections, or he's going to never step down as president. Would say during the first administration, the most pro-Nazi thing he did was send arms to the Ukrainians. This time around, uh, I am very concerned about how close we seem to be moving towards martial law, how much Trump seems to be acting like a dictator and just completely greenlighting everything that this police force is doing. How concerned are you about what's going on with ICE right now?
Well, I mean, I try not to, since my focus is foreign policy, I try not to dig too much into domestic politics. But I mean, the points that Hertling made, that General Hertling made on that are clearly valid, which is that, when you've got this massive expansion of a militaristic force that's going out, that's not prepared to deal with protests, that's not prepared to deal with people coming up to them in the streets that are hostile to them, then you're going to get problems like these and you're going to get blowback. I mean, that's the only one interesting thing that I didn't include in the article, but that one former senior DHS official told me is that they're still holding out hope with ICE in interesting ways, because they maintain a relationship with friends of theirs that are still in ICE. A lot of those friends have been pushing back very hard. They have a feeling that maybe that internal pushback has been part of what helped to create this sort of potential drawdown that we've seen from Minneapolis. So that's their perspective. There is a lot of frustration among especially career people within ICE and within CBP who don't necessarily see this as how they want this to be done.
Yeah, and that statement, some people may be skeptical that anytime they hear from somebody in the government, oh, a lot of people are opposed to this, you think, why is that still happening? But Ken Klippenstein recently talked to quite a few members of ICE, and they pointed out a couple things. They've brought a lot of recruits in, they've brought a lot of people back, as you mentioned, and then they've also just taken requests for people who wanted to go to Minneapolis, and so it was like the most obnoxious, the most gung-ho people that signed up to go. So you kind of, through the selection process, you've had this happen. And he also says there's a lot of drunkenness on the job, almost treating it like a frat house, a frat party, among these ICE officers. And, it really seems to me that the combination of that level of unprofessionalism combined with the kind of lethality that the IDF and also just militarized police approach things in general, but the way the IDF treats the Palestinians, how they handle arrests, how it's all about forcing escalation so you could go on to use lethal force. I mean, this seems like a very dangerous combo, and it really made sense when you see all those factors, what's actually going on in Minneapolis, how this is happening, how these two horrific shootings have happened is because, you have a ultra militarized police force trained by a, ethnocentric military force that's oppressing the other in another part of the world, and the just level of lawlessness and unprofessionalism is astounding and very dangerous.
Right. And I would connect all of this to just the ways in which the very idea of like counterterrorism and terrorism have expanded over the last 20 years. I think it's something that Trump likes things that he can do directly. That's something that we've seen very consistently. He feels as if he can do tariffs by himself. He feels as if he can do military operations by himself, as we saw in Venezuela. And he's confident that he can deploy ICE by himself. And so the things that we've given the president the ability to do, these sort of emergency seeming powers that we gave the president during the war on terror in order to allow them to carry out that war, have created a culture within not just our military, not just the Israeli military, but the Israeli police, the American police in a lot of ways, that we're not just talking about ICE in this case. There are a ton of law enforcement officials from all types of national, local and regional law enforcement that have worked with their counterparts in Israel and developed this counterterror point of view. And in the Trump administration, when you're talking about their goal of expelling a large number of undocumented immigrants, a big way that they have talked about that population is that they are terrorists, right? That they are associated with these Venezuelan gangs, for example, that they are associated with MS-13, these different groups that the Trump administration in its second term has designated as actual foreign terrorist organizations, which has a certain amount of power in terms of what you do legally, but also has a certain amount of just emotional power where, if you're an ICE officer and you are on the street and you are dealing with a terrorist, and Kristi Noem, the Department of Homeland Security secretary, is out there saying that these people are terrorists, you feel very empowered because terrorists are inherently the worst kind of people to be. So it's really the coming together, the apogee of all of these trends that we've seen over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, and another factor in all that, I'm sure, is that so many of these guys that are signing up to work with ICE were in the U.S. military and were conducting actual counter-terrorist operations in actual war zones. And so, if you're telling them that the mission is the same and then they treat it the same way and start killing people, it really can't be surprising. Now, in all this, it does just bring up like kind of a really important point that this is supposed to be enforcement of immigration, and this shift to counterterrorism seems like quite a big deal, right? And it also really expands who's being targeted from just the potential illegal immigrants. Although we know ICE has picked up brown Americans, and I think one guy, they picked him up at Walmart and beat him up and dropped him off in the parking lot of a Target. Just absurd cruelty for absolutely no reason, and really does resemble like the kind of awful things that the IDF does to Palestinians in the West Bank. But by expanding it to counterterrorism, now it's not just the immigrants, the illegal immigrants, it's all the Americans that would go out in the street and defend them as well. Then you're defending the terrorists and therefore a terrorist. I mean, this is why Americans are being shot and killed by ICE and not just immigrants.
Right. Right. And that's where some of the profiling elements come in too. I mean, that's something that came up in my reporting that, a former senior DHS official had talked about with their colleagues at the time, was this weirdness. There was this Israeli officer. I'm not sure exactly what they were affiliated with. I don't know if the person remembered, but that was making comment that was basically arguing that you need to engage in more profiling, that has a certain amount of value. And we're seeing that translated here, profiling based on who you assume would be an undocumented immigrant, or profiling based on who you assume would be, a terrorist who might, or, in their view, a terrorist who might impede your ability to conduct an arrest. And, it's a demonization, obviously, of people is a clear trend between the two. But just this idea that you're allowed to use quite a bit of violence to deal with the thing if you can describe the threat in the broadest possible terms. I don't know. I mean, one thing I'm interested in too here, though, is the extent to which Trump will draw back on all of this. That's who knows at this point. Obviously, there's a little bit there, but even if he does draw back, I will highlight that the culture of a lot of these organizations, in the same way that I'm sure you've shown your viewers, and I'm sure they've been interested in over the past couple of years, the culture of the IDF, the culture of the Israeli police, national security ministry, all those things, just ends up going in these directions where they view the public as an enemy, the public that they're dealing with, and they treat it as such.
Absolutely. Connor, before we wrap up here, I do want to talk about the situation going on in the Middle East. The Trump administration has engaged in this massive military buildup against Iran, and Trump renewed his threats against Iran, this time saying that, hey, if Iran doesn't agree to a new deal that includes no nuclear weapons, then he's going to attack. And Connor, I gotta say, I was a little bit confused why I initially read this, because just a couple weeks ago, you had written an article saying that Donald Trump was going to attack Iran for killing protesters. And so, just how many conditions does Trump now? I mean, do you think he's just trying to invent reasons to attack Iran until one of them seems to resonate and stick with the American people? Or what's all the threatening going on here?
I think that it's fairly clear that there's a few things that are at play here, but there's I guess number one is that Trump, I do think, very much wants to get rid of the government in Iran. I don't think that he's shown a particular interest in negotiations up to this point. But the thing that has held him back in a lot of ways is the fear of messiness, the fear that there will be, there was reporting, I honestly don't know where it came out of, but there was, reputable reporting during the last couple of weeks talking about how Trump pulled back from what seemed to be, imminent attacks because he thought that it could lead to even more of a mess during these massive protests in which the Iranian government was working to really aggressively crack down. They killed a huge number of people in a very scary situation there. And if he would have bombed during that crackdown, the likelihood of it all turning to total chaos was pretty high. But as we saw in Venezuela, and as we saw in sort of the decision-making there and then in the conversation about it after, Trump wants to be able to say that he has done things quickly and gotten quick successes and pulled back in a way that's not going to be costly to the American people, in a way that's not going to be a forever war, not going to be nation building, not going to be regime change. That's how he wants to argue it. And so I think that he is waiting for a moment where he can carry out strikes and where what comes next won't look messy in the same way.
Yeah, I think he's going to just have a much harder time doing that with Iran than with Venezuela. I think it would be absurd to think that they could pull off a similar operation and just say capture the Ayatollah or even any high-ranking Iranian official. And so Iran is a massive country, 80 million people. I think it's 3 or 4 times the size of Iraq. It's mountainous. It's got deserts, lots of places to hide the missile launchers and things like that. But at the same time, it does seem like there's a real effort in the administration to build up the argument to go to war. And this is Marco Rubio speaking to the Senate yesterday.
On the issue of our presence in the region, here's the baseline I want to set for everybody. The baseline is this. We have 30 to 40,000 American troops stationed across 8 or 9 facilities in that region. All are within the reach. Theoretically, not theoretically, in reality, all are within the reach of an array of thousands of Iranian one-way UAVs and Iranian short-term ballistic missiles, short-range ballistic missiles that threaten our troop presence. We have to have enough force and power in the region just on a baseline to defend against that possibility, that at some point, as a result of something, the Iranian regime decides to strike at our troop presence in the region. The president always reserves the preemptive defensive option. In essence, if we have indications that, in fact, they're going to attack our troops in the region, to defend our personnel in the region. We also have security agreements, the Defense of Israel Plan and others, that require us to have a force posture in the region to defend against that. And so I think it's wise and prudent to have a force posture within the region that could respond and potentially, not necessarily what's going to happen, but if necessary, preemptively prevent the attack against thousands of American servicemen and other facilities in the region and our allies. I hope it doesn't come to that, but that's, I think, what you're seeing now is the ability to posture assets in the region to defend against what could be an Iranian threat against our personnel. They certainly have the capability to do it because they've amassed thousands and thousands of ballistic missiles that they've built, despite the fact that their economy is collapsing. They keep spending money on that.
Thank you.
So, Connor, what do you make of this? Rubio is saying and arguing that Trump has the right to launch a war against Iran if Iran is threatening the U.S. forces that Trump is threatening Iran with.
Right. It just points. I know that a lot of people are down on the concept of international law in general. They see it as kind of weak, but I think that we've seen a particular collapse of that. I really since the war on terror, but under Trump, it's gotten even worse, where this idea of preemptive self-defense in advance of them potentially attacking our troops that are already in the region is outrageous, right? It's completely at odds with the Charter of the United Nations. It's completely at odds with just basic logic about, if you can just put assets in a region and it makes it justifiable for you to then launch a war, then, the Russians should have, the Soviets should have launched missiles from Cuba with no problem in their heart, right? But that's silly because you can't just put things around there and expect countries like in the Cuba case, you couldn't have expected the U.S. to not be annoyed about that, but you also would have rightly expected that they wouldn't simply launch missiles right there. So I think it's just totally backwards logic, and I think it's a really clear sign that this administration, not to say that other administrations weren't problematic on this front, but that this administration is just really ripping up the idea of international law.
Yeah, and I mean, on top of that, and maybe more importantly to me as an American, the Constitution. I mean, a different session of Congress, Rubio is saying they're arguing that the War Powers Act allows the United States to go to war anywhere they want across the entire globe for 60 days. And if it goes over 60 days, then they have to go to Congress. Of course, by the time U.S. troops are in any country for 60 days, those troops will be under attack. And then the U.S. government could say that, under the president's Article 2 powers as commander in chief and ability to defend our forces, we have the right to continue this war. And so, it's all just this giant game that they use to create war wherever they want in the world. Really, the only amazing thing to me about what the Trump administration is doing is just how little they're trying with the propaganda. I mean, the run up to the Iraq war, it was 18 months about after 9/11. It took a lot of propaganda, a lot of narratives, yellow cake uranium, ties to Al Qaeda. He's bad to his people. He tortures his people. He's coming for the United States. He tried to assassinate a former president, right? And with Venezuela, they just make up a lie, and in a couple weeks, they kidnap the country's president. And with Iran, now they've put all this massive military buildup, an aircraft carrier strike group, advanced air defense systems, additional fighter jets. They put a similar military footprint in the Middle East now to what they had during the 12-day war that happened over the summer, where Israel launched that unprovoked attack against Iran. So I'm very concerned that we are going to see some sort of U.S. attack on Iran in the coming days. And I worry that, last time, I think everybody involved got very lucky, right? Because Iran's in a position where they can hit Israel back and they can hit U.S. bases, but Israel and the U.S. have nuclear weapons. And so if Iran hits back too hard, they're probably going to get nuked. At the same time, the U.S. could have just kept bombing Iran, and they didn't. So there's a lot of places where this thing could really escalate and get dangerous. Connor, any insights on what we're going to see the Trump administration do over the next 2 weeks as they get all this military assets in the Middle East? Trump is making these threats. Everybody appears to be getting ready for war. The Russians are getting ready to evacuate their nuclear scientists from Iranian power plants. Are you worried that this is going to be a conflict that we're going to see this year?
Absolutely. I think it's pretty likely. It's hard to, again, the challenge is that Trump doesn't go out and build support for this in the public, as you pointed out, right? He sort of jumps to it. So the decision is in Trump's head. We're not going to have an 18-month walk up like we did with the Iraq war. Like you said, we're not going to have that situation. So it's just really the mood that Trump finds himself in and whether he thinks that he can contain this. I don't know. There are strong incentives for de-escalation after a war starts between the U.S. and Iran, or at least there were last year, and that, kept a very scary situation happening, but it did lead to eventually de-escalation. It did lead that war to stop. So I guess that's the most hopeful thing that I could have. Like, the Iranians have extremely strong incentives to de-escalate whenever they can. But that calculus could change if they become convinced that some version of winning this war is essential to saving the regime. So that would be my concern. But I would add one more thing in relation to this general problem and in relation to the logic that Rubio put forth in that Senate hearing that you referenced yesterday that we saw the clip from, is that this really gets at the importance of drawing down troops from the Middle East for getting us out of these different things, right? Like, as long as there are American troops there are going to be politicians saying that we need to be ready to preemptively defend them. We need to be ready to go to war with Iran if necessary. And if we allow that situation to continue, if we allow there to still be tens of thousands of American troops there, we're going to run into these problems over and over. And on some levels, Trump is doing well here. It seems that he, or at least an official told me a couple weeks ago, that we are going to be leaving Iraq, for example, by the end of September. And, there's talk about leaving Syria too. And those things are good, but there needs to be more momentum in order for crises like this to not keep happening.
Yeah. Well, you would hope that if they really were just planning on pulling the troops out of Iraq and Syria by the end of the year, we would just get them out now so they're not potential targets in this, Iranian potential conflict with Iran, which they certainly will be if Trump moves forward with strikes. Connor Eccles, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and of course, you do amazing work over at Responsible Statecraft. Everybody, be sure to keep up with what Connor writes. It's a lot of really good in-depth reporting like you did in this ICE and IDF article. And Connor, I look forward to having you back on the show again in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, Kyle. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.